everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is David Daoud, a senior fellow at the FDD. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Brittany, it's a pleasure as always.
We are about a week and a half right now into the war with Iran, and I really want to talk about the moment we're in, because it seems like we're getting some mixed messaging from both President Trump himself as well as the administration. And I want to talk about some things that were said on Monday. Starting Monday afternoon, he had an interview with CBS, and he said, "I think the war is very complete, pretty much." Around the same time, the Department of Defense, their rapid response account on X, posted, "We have only just begun to fight." On that post, there was a graphic of a missile, and superimposed on that graphic was "No mercy." Later in the day, President Trump was speaking to Republicans in Florida, and this is what he said. "We've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough." Then in a press briefing after, he said this: "We are ahead of our initial timeline by a lot." He also added that we could call it a tremendous success now, or we could go further, and we're going to go further. What do you make of all of that messaging? Where are we now?
The question with President Trump is he speaking in specifics or is he speaking in generalities? And this leads to the impression that he's giving mixed messages. If we go back to even the outset of the conflict, right, the first statement that President Trump gave on Operation Epic Fury, as it's been dubbed, is that it seemed like this is a war for the whose end goal was the collapse of the Iranian regime, right? He's asking for the Iranian people to come out into the streets and retake their country, as he put it. Similar messaging came out of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And then within the next few days, we saw President Trump speak to Axios and then The Atlantic, talking about offering the Iranians off-ramps and opportunities for negotiation, which cuts at cross ends with the idea of regime change. And I think what we're seeing from President Trump is perhaps he's speaking about generalities, right? He's speaking in a general sense that, he doesn't want to invade Iran. He doesn't want to put boots on the ground. But what he means by negotiations, let's say if we're talking about, the off-ramps, is coming to terms with what the United States is demanding, end to the nuclear program, end to regional interference, end to human rights abuses, and end to all the things that effectively make the Iranian regime what it is. So it's calling for regime change without calling for regime change. Now, when we talk about the progress of the war, I think there's something similar going on here, where President Trump is saying, we've done a lot. We've done significant damage to Iran. We've done significant damage to its military capabilities. That can be deemed enough. But, what the other statements, either from the Department of War or from President Trump himself, indicate that he thinks that there's a lot more that we can do, and that's true. The Iranian regime is far from collapsing, and the Iranian armed forces, be it the IRGC, the Artesh, are far from conventional military defeat or surrender.
I want to dive a little deeper into that. You're saying the Iranian regime is far from collapsing. Iran multiple times in recent days repeatedly dismissed calls for a ceasefire. President Trump last week said there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. And President Trump multiple times has said he wants to see in Iran something similar to Venezuela, and just how successful the operation in Venezuela was, which essentially just 2 months ago, U.S. forces took out the country's sitting leader, Maduro, and then bumped up his number two, now as the president. So the regime remained intact. They just took the top out. Do you think that would work in Iran?
Well, let me start with saying I don't think we can take the pronouncements of the Iranian regime in public at face value. This is a regime, its durability, its existence, its ability to continue drawing support from domestic supporters and the broader resistance axis is premised on the idea that it will always have the upper hand over the United States. It will never surrender to the United States. It will never bow to U.S. terms. And this is the image it's going to always project publicly. This is why we see entities like Hezbollah, despite suffering tremendous defeat, still claim victory. They cannot admit defeat, because then their utility to their followers will be called into question. Now, would something similar to Venezuela work in Iran? I don't think so, because what we have in the Iranian regime is something that came to power itself to regime change in a country that had undergone a coup prior to that even, right? So they know what the Iranian regime wants, this current Iranian regime, what it wants is to perpetuate the ideology upon which it is built. And it is putting fail-safes to ensure that what happened to the Shah and what happened to the Qajar dynasty before them will not happen to it. right? Even the death of the supreme leader, as significant as it is, you have the Expediency Council that can step in and ensure that another leader is elected in a timely fashion and the regime is perpetuated. So even if you remove Khamenei himself, or now his son Mujtaba, and you replace him with a leader that may appear softer on the surface, the problem is that the apparatus, the system itself, is meant to perpetuate everything that has brought us to this war, right? Everything that Iran has done domestically and regionally, pursuit of nuclear weapons, and I'm putting this in a simplified fashion, but the so-called exportation of the revolution, regional destabilization, the building of militias, this is caked into the Iranian regime itself, and not just into the DNA or the ideology or the outlook of one leader or another. So, having a Venezuela situation, I don't think would solve the problem with Iran.
What does that mean then for the people of Iran? Because as we remember, President Trump, starting in January, was tweeting out support of them, saying, keep going, help is on the way. Then when he was announcing Operation Epic Fury, he said, once the bombs stop dropping, go and take over your government. Mm-hmm. I mean, if it's not just one specific person that once they're gone, things can change. If it's a whole apparatus, it's the system that's the issue. Mm-hmm. How do they dismantle that if they can?
Well, again, Iran is no stranger to regime change. There was a system prior to the one that exists now that was taken out by revolution, which the Khomeinists, right, there was an Iranian revolution in 1979, which the Islamists, the Khomeinists, were able to exploit to put themselves in power. So Iran has experience with removing one governmental apparatus and replacing it with another. What that will look like will be up to the Iranian people, and how far that goes will be up to the Iranian people. The most we can do as the United States is to clear the pathway, right? Break the barrier of fear, break the monopoly of violence. The Iranian people live in a police state where violence is monopolized by a clique. Right, this Iranian regime, and I'm not saying it doesn't have domestic support. Of course it does. We don't know the level of that support, obviously. But this Iranian regime has monopolized violence and is willing to, I'll quote a former colleague of mine, rule over rubble, then cede an inch of power. Right? So this is not an entity with which the Iranian people, if they want something different, can come to a modus vivendi or a compromise or genuine change. The Iranian regime may over time relax itself in certain ways. It may tighten the grip in certain ways, but it's all in service of the perpetuation of this foundational ideology. So what we can do as the United States with our Israeli allies, and if our Gulf and Arab allies wish to participate as well, is to remove that monopoly on violence, to degrade the ability of the Iranian regime to cow its people into accepting this tyrannical status quo. The rest will be up to them, and what it will look like will be up to them.
And as of now, the new supreme leader is the supreme leader who was killed. It's his son. What do you make of that choice, and what does that tell you of where the regime is right now?
So look, I'm not, you have to speak probably to one of my colleagues who focus more on Iran, on the specifics. But my knowledge of Mujtaba Khamenei is that his name has been tabled for years as a potential successor to his father. So this isn't surprising. It seems like the Iranian regime is becoming increasingly dynastic. We've seen this also with Hezbollah, for example, where Hassan Nasrallah's heir apparent before he was assassinated was Hashim Safiuddin, who's his maternal cousin. So there's this dynasticism that's being built into the resistance axis. And from what I know about Mujtaba Khamenei, what's said about him is that he's his father on steroids. He's a more extreme version of his father. Now, this doesn't mean that necessarily they ideologically differ. It means that perhaps experience and dare I say, the wisdom that comes with it led Khamenei to be more pragmatic and more practical. Ali Khamenei to be more pragmatic and more practical at different times, whereas Mujtaba may be less so. It does not mean that they are pursuing different end goals, or that Ali Khamenei's end goals or ultimate vision for what the region in Iran would look like would have somehow been more moderate. It's just he may have pursued that through more pragmatic and more practical means, whereas Mujtaba may be willing to throw caution more to the wind.
In the past 10 days, we've seen this conflict spread into the wider region, and I do want to talk about that because 2 days after the United States and Israel launched their joint strikes on Iran, Hezbollah launched missiles into Israel as retaliation for the Ayatollah's death. Since then, Israel retaliated with aggressive strikes of their own, and Lebanon's president since then has called for an immediate ceasefire with Israel, negotiations to begin, and a promise that Lebanon would disarm Hezbollah. What do you make of this part of the conflict?
A lot to break down there. Let's start with the fact that, so in Hezbollah's initial statement said retaliation for Ali Khamenei's assassination, and then also in response to Israel's ongoing operations in Lebanon. And since then, right, there's been domestic backlash, right? The Lebanese government the next day issued a decision that for the first time, unprecedented and really should be welcomed on its face, prescribing Hezbollah's military activity, ordering the organization in no uncertain terms to disarm. This is unprecedented, right? This is what Lebanon didn't do in September of 2025 when it claimed to adopt the LAF's disarmament plan. And since then, given the domestic backlash, given that Hezbollah has invited not just on the Lebanese writ large, but specifically on its own Shiite base, right? The Shiite base that gives it durability, legitimacy, longevity in Lebanon, without whom it is a finite organization that the Lebanese government can easily dismantle. Right, tried to reframe this as a defense of Lebanon, as a preemption of a pre-planned Israeli war on Lebanon, which is the same narrative, by the way, that they used on October 8th of 2023 when they dragged Lebanon also into a foreign war. So they've been focusing on this Lebanese dimension, that this was self-defense of Lebanon. I don't buy either of it, right? Ali Khamenei was already in his 80s. He was already set to die. Hezbollah is loyal more to the apparatus, the system, the survival of the system, rather than to any individual leader. They could have easily fund this as they have with the death of Qasem Soleimani, Hassan Nasrallah, or other significant figures. And I realize Ali Khamenei is a little bit more significant than them in the broader scheme of things. But they could have spun this as an inevitable martyrdom in the long war against the United States and its forward military base, its tool, the state of Israel, that is going to end up in inevitable and divinely guaranteed victory. Right? Given that the predictable Israeli response was going to be this ferocious, right? Hezbollah has effectively invited potential destruction upon itself. So it doesn't make sense that they're going to do it for a man as significant as he is, that was going to probably die in a few years. And anyway, it was going to be replaced and has been replaced. Also, the argument that this is defense for Lebanon, again, doesn't make sense, because from Hezbollah's own statements, Israel's been operating in Lebanon, attacking Hezbollah for 15 months straight, and Hezbollah just coincidentally picks this time while Iran is under attack from the United States and Israel. No, I think the argument, or the real reason, is that Hezbollah sensed that the direction of the Israeli and American war in Iran was endangering the existence of the system. Not that the system itself was in danger now, but that we're heading in that direction, and that if Hezbollah doesn't intervene now to divide up Israeli forces, through that slowing the impact of the war in Iran, slowing down the war's progress, and in the process, right, but the war is not domestically popular in the United States. President Trump was very aware of his popularity, has midterms coming up. The longer this war drags on, the longer, the more American casualties it causes, the more impact it causes to the American taxpayer, say through oil prices rising and so on and so forth. That could impact President Trump's calculus, leading him to accept a premature ceasefire, right? If you can't confront the U.S. or Israeli military directly, which the Iranians and Hezbollah accept, right, what do? You go to the people who ultimately control them, and that is the American or Israeli people. You do the things that will impact them and their decision-making so that we can lean in on our governments to stop the progress of the war. And I think that's what Hezbollah is doing now, absorbing pain to slow the war in Iran so the regime can have a higher chance of survival. Now, as for Lebanon's decisions, again, significant, but there's been no follow-through, right? There's been the arrests that the LAF has done against alleged, and even according to the LAF, these are alleged Hezbollah members, they're not confirmed, happened passively. These were gunmen that happened to pass through LAF checkpoints that were arrested. I think there were 27 total of them. And many of them have been released by Lebanese military tribunals on $20 American bail days later. Otherwise, we've not seen any action by the Lebanese government, which to me casts a pall of suspicion on even President Hollande's offer to negotiate with Israel. The pattern that we've seen from Lebanon, not just in this conflict, but leading up to the November 2024 ceasefire, and the decades prior to that, is that the Lebanese will say anything. Right? If we go back to Resolution 1701 in 2006, had it been implemented, Hezbollah would not exist. We would not be in this conflict. That was an adaptation of a Lebanese governmental decision, and yet Lebanon never implemented it. So the pattern that we've seen is that Lebanon will promise the sky just to get the bombs to stop, and then once that happens, the actual details get lost in the Byzantine maze of Lebanese politics until international attention simply turns elsewhere, because Lebanon is, on the grand scheme of things, not as significant as other arenas, and then it gets forgotten. Lebanon gets to go back to the status quo ante, and I genuinely worry that this is what's happening now, because if there is an opportunity for Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah without risking civil war, it is right now, because Hezbollah's forces are bogged down fighting a much more powerful foe, the Israelis. The Lebanese people's anger at Hezbollah is probably at the highest it's ever going to be. And the Shia population, right? This is how Hezbollah has deterred Lebanon from acting against it. It's always been, well, we have the overwhelming support of Shiites. If you come against us, Lebanese government, all these Shiites are going to think you're coming against their domestic prerogatives, right? Against the guarantor of their domestic equality, which is Hezbollah, and against the guarantor of their safety against external threats, which is Hezbollah's arsenal. And that'll lead to civil war. But the Shiite population, I can't imagine they're happy about what's happening now. They barely put their lives back together from the last war. And even if that anger is not so widespread among Lebanese Shiites, they're being displaced. They're in no position to act as Hezbollah's foot soldiers or shield on the ground now. So if Lebanon has an opportunity to go after Hezbollah, it's now. And Hezbollah itself has recognized it. Naim Qassem, in his only speech to date on the issue, has said, don't stab us in the back. He realizes the group's back is exposed. So I worry that Lebanon is saying a lot of big things, but it's not being followed through with action.
What's next then in this portion of the war? Because A, how successful do you think Hezbollah is in their strategy of, almost like you said, being a distraction, trying to distract Israel to come fight them on one front? And then B, what's Israel thinking in all of this? Are they intrigued by the Lebanese president saying this? What does that look like?
The success of Hezbollah's strategy, we'll have to wait till the day after the war to see whether Hezbollah's strategy succeeded or not. Right now, I think they're trying, and they are dividing up Israeli forces on two fronts. But from reporting, we've seen Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's directives to the IDF is still to prioritize Iran. And Israel, I mean, Hezbollah should have known this, its history, even when it was weaker, economically, militarily, more isolated, its history is replete with fighting multi-front wars. I mean, from 1948 to 1967 to 1973, Israel has fought multi-front wars almost as a default, and it also did post October 7th. All right, fighting against the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and even some alleged attacks from the Iraqi militias and Iran, all simultaneously. So Israel has the capability, it has the doctrine, and it probably has the means to prosecute this war with a sufficient degree of intensity on both fronts. Now, what the Israelis are thinking about these offers, it seems like they're very skeptical. Amichai Shikli was a cabinet minister, and he's one of the more spicy, let's call him, ones. So his statements should not necessarily be taken as the baseline of what Israel is thinking, but it's out there. He tweeted something earlier today, if I'm not mistaken, basically being very dismissive of the LAF and Beirut. The Israeli defense minister, Israel Katz, said in an interview with Channel 13 that the IDF is expected to remain in Lebanon indefinitely in security zones. I mean, this reflects a lack of confidence in Lebanon's ability to do the job. At the same time, there's a Financial Times article that came out, I think, just before I came on this interview, that was saying that the Israeli thinking is that the war against Hezbollah will have to continue even after the war against Iran may end. And again, this reflects the idea that Israel is not putting much confidence in the Lebanese state, in the Lebanese state's pronouncements. And why? Because November 27th, 2024, brought about a ceasefire. There were a lot of commitments from Lebanon made at the time of that ceasefire. There was a change in government that was very promising. President On was elected to much international, even Israeli fanfare. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam then put together a cabinet whose policy statement for the first time, right, this is the Lebanese cabinet's policy statement. This is like the direction that the cabinet intends to go for the duration that it's in power. For the first time in 30 years, did not include a clause that supported the right of resistance. This had been a fixture in every Lebanese cabinet's policy statement since the end of the civil war, including the cabinets of Rafiq Hariri, Fouad Siniora, Saad Hariri, right? Very ostensibly pro-Western cabinets, allies of the United States, even they affirmed the right of resistance. So this was promising. Then there was all the talk of the LAF's disarmament plan, planning to disarm Hezbollah by the end of the year. And that timeline kept shifting. When the time came to adopt the LAF plan, Lebanon didn't explicitly, they welcomed it instead. They maintained this strange ambiguity about it. And then what it meant kept changing. It went from disarmament by the end of the year throughout Lebanon to only disarmament south of the Litani River. And then it went from disarmament to containing Hezbollah's arsenal. And then by the time the LAF declared on January 8th, 2026, that they basically disarmed Hezbollah south of the Litani River, Hezbollah refused to commit to that. Right prior to that, in July of 2025, Naim Qassem was asked specifically about the LAF and Lebanese officials' claims of dismantling 500 Lebanese or Hezbollah sites south of the Litani River. And he told us in an interview on Al Mayadeen, he said, they've disarmed what they've seen. Thank God the country is vast. Right. And he, again, after the LAF's declaration, he refused to issue a declaration of his own. And then the Israelis continued striking Hezbollah personnel that they were alleging were involved in local regeneration efforts in the South Litani area. So in the area that the LAF had just claimed we've disarmed, we've cleared of Hezbollah. And what the conflict now has proved, right? Most of the attacks against Israel, there's ground clashes between the IDF and Hezbollah forces, there are rocket attacks, it's all coming from the South Litani area. It is demonstrated conclusively that the Lebanese government's claims were utterly false. So if you're Israel, you've sat there for 15 months waiting for Lebanon to act. You've heard a lot of high-minded talk from the Lebanese, a lot of promises, and no follow-through. And this is building up off of 18 years prior to that, from 2006 until October 8th of 2023, 20 years up to now since the Second Lebanon War of similar claims by the Lebanese government. Again, Resolution 1701, which should have resulted in Hezbollah's dismantlement, was a Lebanese governmental draft initially. So you've heard a lot of promises from Lebanon over the years, including this after this most recent conflict, and almost zero follow-through. So I don't blame Jerusalem for having zero confidence in Beirut's pronouncements and being unwilling to take any risk or any chance that Hezbollah, will not be able to once again, exploit Lebanese inaction, to rearm as it has over the past year, and to make sure that it can no longer menace northern Israel.
If Israel's reportedly thinking that this war in Iran could be on a different timeline with than the conflict with Hezbollah, I mean, are these two separate wars? And is there any chance that the United States could then join Israel in its fight against Hezbollah?
I don't think they're two separate wars. They're mutually reinforcing wars that also operate on different timelines, and this is because of the way the Iranian model of setting up its proxies works. So the Iranian model is, it's almost apparent to a child, right? If a parent raises their child to have the capability to, survive on their own, make their own money, right? Your goal as a parent is to get your child out of the house and to be self-sufficient, right? Because you realize that the link between a parent and a child isn't based on material benefit, at least, normally speaking, right? So with Hezbollah and Iran, Hezbollah has described itself as an extension of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, almost a child of the Iranian Revolution. Its link to Iran is not material. If the weapons, if the money were to stop from Tehran tomorrow, Hezbollah would still answer Iran's call at the drop of a hat, because the link is ideological. The link is that Hezbollah views that the government in Iran is this justly divinely guided government that is ruling on behalf of the awaited Mahdi until he comes. So that allows Iran to, the lever that Iran has over Hezbollah it will always be there, and it allows Iran to build up its proxies, especially one as loyal as Hezbollah, to have autonomy, to have its own fundraising capabilities, to have its own weapons production capabilities, and they may not be as sophisticated as what Iran can provide, but it still allows Hezbollah to perpetuate itself. And Hezbollah has a lot of fundraising channels. I think we have to look at that, right, more so than the weapons production capabilities. Fundraising channels that are illegal, somewhat in some cases, right, otherwise legal in terms, I mean, they have restaurants, they have gas stations, they have, charity drives and so on and so forth. They have pharmacies in Lebanon. Had it not been a terrorist organization, these would have been totally legitimate fundraising methods. They also tap into criminality and other darker methods of fundraising. And this allows Hezbollah to self-perpetuate. So if the regime in Iran were to fall tomorrow or to be severely diminished, yes, this would be a significant setback for Hezbollah, but it would not automatically lead to its demise. And I think the Israeli decision-making is starting to realize that and to say Hezbollah needs to be treated on its own, even though there is a symbiosis and obvious linkage to Iran. Now, whether the United States needs to intervene against Hezbollah is a separate question. Look, the Hezbollah's unique dedication to Israel's destruction can create the impression that Israel is Hezbollah's primary enemy, that Hezbollah considers Israel its primary enemy. That's untrue. Hezbollah ideologically, according to its 1985 open letter, every statement from its leaders from Hezbollah's rise, from the declaration of its rise in the 1985 open letter to the present, have made it absolutely clear the United States is Hezbollah's primary enemy, that every battle that Hezbollah fights is measured by its fight against the United States. This is why they came out in full-throated support. Their media, their propaganda apparatus came out in full-throated support of the Russian war in Ukraine. What does that have to do with Lebanon? What does that have to do with, Hezbollah's claims of being a Lebanese resistance organization? Why? And they said it explicitly, because this will break American global hegemony. Their goal is to diminish the United States. They view America as ultimately responsible for, as they put it, the crimes of a sometimes hesitant Israel, right? The 2006 war, according to Hezbollah's narrative, was forced upon a reluctant Israel by a United States that wanted to break Lebanon as part of creating the new Middle East. So ultimately, the fight is against the United States. And if we look at the number of casualties that Hezbollah has caused over the years, yeah, they've killed more Israelis. But if we look at the concentration, right, their deadliest attack to date remains the 1983 Marine barracks bombing. The concentration of deaths of Americans is in such a clustered timeline between 1983 and 1988, give or take, right? Hezbollah has had 40 years of fight with Israel, 2 major wars, 2 major operations, and they've only managed in that timeline to kill only twice as much Israelis as Americans, right? And that hatred against the United States is demonstrated through these casualty numbers. And meanwhile, right, the Americans that they've killed were in Lebanon as diplomats. In the case of the Marines, they were there as peacemakers, as peacekeepers. They even almost clashed with the Israelis at different times, the Marines in Beirut, to safeguard Lebanese. So if we look at who Hezbollah has killed and why, it also demonstrates that they have this fixation on the United States, and they will take every opportunity to kill Americans directly, as they did in Lebanon, indirectly, as they did through propping up Shia militias in Iraq. And if they don't have that opportunity, then through narrative and propaganda warfare to convince the peoples of the region that America is an enemy, that America should be expelled, that every manifestation, and I'm quoting Hassan Nasrallah here, every manifestation of American presence and power is a danger to the region. Why? So they can diminish our regional presence in this area that is rich in natural resources, rich in strategic trade routes, and in doing so, diminish our global influence. And then, in an ideal world, Hezbollah, the resistance axis, Tehran, their broader allies will be able to dictate to the United States, including domestically, rather than the other way around.
Well, I'm sure there's certainly a lot to look out for as this war continues. David Daoud, I really appreciate your expertise here, your insights, and as we see developments come out of the Middle East and beyond, I hope you can come back on and break them down with me. Thank you so much for the time.
I'd be more than glad to, Brittany. Thank you for having me on.